Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Soundrise podcast. So, today we will be talking about none other than Tina Turner, a legendary female vocalist. She's had numerous hits, great success, a very major star, one might say. So, Alexander, you decided that we should cover Tina Turner today. Can you tell me why did you decide to opt for Tina?
Hello, everyone. Hope you're all well. Yeah, Vlada. So, to answer your question, we talked about the Grammys the other week, and the same night when we talked about it, I went to Google to search the biggest snubs in the Grammy Awards history, and many consider Tina Turner to be, if not the biggest snub in Grammys history. So I just wanted to take a closer look to her work. I hadn't been so familiar with her discography before choosing it for this episode. So yeah, I just wanted to see how big it is and how grandiose she actually sounds.
All right. Okay, before we get into the records, I just want to mention our Patreons. So, a huge shout out to our current Patreons, Stephanie, Asha, and David. Your support has been invaluable, not just in terms of financial support, but also in terms of your feedback and your advice. So, everyone else, please feel encouraged to give us your feedback, to let us know what you think of our show, or perhaps leave a comment about the musicians and artists that we're covering in our show. Okay, so Alexander, we have three albums today. And interestingly enough, all of these three albums are Tina Turner's solo efforts. So without her former husband, Ike Turner. Is there any
Yeah.
reason behind this? Because we all know that Ike and Tina Turner also had quite a few classic records and hits.
Yeah, I just wanted to explore her solo work. I wanted to see what she was like. I know that she was great also with Ike, but I was just more interested in hearing her solo work because in those in those articles regarding the biggest snubs in Grammy history that I just mentioned, usually they say that she deserves the most praise uh, for these records that I chose for this episode.
All right, that will be interesting to hear then, especially seeing how these works compare to some other of her stuff that we might have not covered. Because I have to say, it's quite a departure between her early work with Ike and what she did later on. So for me, it would be interesting to compare these. However, we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on these three records, starting with 1984 Private Dancer. So, Alexander, this is a major record for Tina Turner, a major hit, a great comeback. She was away for a few years before recording this album. So, what's your take on this one?
I think it's a classic, and I think that both Private Dancer and Break Every Rule are that type of records that kind of define the 80s sound. Private Dancer sounds very good to me. I'm especially excited about her cover of the David Bowie's 1984. I thought it was a brilliant cover. And also, we have to mention that song was not from a well-known Bowie album, the Diamond Dog. So well done on that. This album also features a lot of major hits, and I'm not gonna go too deep into the awards and the charts. I think she absolutely dominated the charts at that time. And also, I would like to share an interesting fact about this
Mm-hmm.
record. It says that in 2020, The album was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Recording Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that is impressive. And yes, this album has a reputation of a classic record. Uh, and as you mentioned, there are quite a few interesting cover songs, not just by David Bowie, but also she covered the Beatles, she covered Al Green. So it's interesting to hear Tina tackling some of these classics. Well, I listened to this record before we opted to do Tina for the show. So it is a classic 80s sound record, but having said that, it contains a lot of strong performances by Tina, especially on the classic songs like What's Love Got to Do with It, or the title track, Private Dancer, which I think is quite amazing. And interestingly enough, about that track is that it was originally written by Mark Knopfler and it was conceived as a Dire Straits track. However,
Wow.
it was meant to be on Love Over Gold record, one of Dire Straits' best albums, in my opinion at least. But I think there is some kind of similarity between that song and some other songs on the album, which is probably the reason why Mark decided to give it away to Tina. So this recording of Private Dancer does not feature Mark Knopfler. However, it does feature all the other members of Dire Straits at that time, as well as Jeff Beck on the guitar. So that's quite a lineup there. And I think Jeff Beck is also featured on some other tracks throughout the album. So another interesting fact. So some amazing players on this album.
Yeah, and what I like about this and what I like about Tina in general is that regardless whether the song is from this or the other artist, she really puts a lot of emotion in her singing. And her, as I said, I hadn't been so familiar with her work before this episode, but when I started listening to this record, yeah, the voice was immediately recognizable, and I think it's hugely influential in the pop music world. So really dig the emotion and the power that she puts in her singing alongside the superb musicianship from the team.
Yeah, most definitely. And also, this record pretty much serves as the template for her 80s and 90s solo career. I think all the other records that we listen to are pretty much based on this one in terms of sound, in terms of arrangements, for better or worse. My main gripe with this record, however, is that it sounds too commercial. Like her performances are pretty amazing. I love her performances. I love her vocals. There's nothing to argue there. It's just plain classic. But some of the arrangements are a bit too cheesy. Some of the cover versions don't really cut it for me, especially Help, because it sounds completely different from the Beatles original to the point where it's almost unrecognizable, And I know that sometimes it's cool to have a completely different interpretation of a song, but in this case, it just doesn't add anything to it, in my opinion. So this is not a perfect record, but because of some of the classic tracks on it, you can argue that it's still a classic, especially when it comes to 80s pop. If that's your thing, then you have to listen to this album.
Yes, I would definitely agree with the commercial part because um, partially, the album sounds good. The album sounds very good, but it is kind of commercial and sweet sounding tunes and really something that, and also the lyrics, and it's all related to relationships, to love, to interpersonal interpersonal stuff, and I think that's something that everyone can listen to, and everyone can latch on that. So uh,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe we can say that's a negative, but I think that really boils down to your taste.
I mean, yes. Really, there's nothing really offensive about this album. It's more about the fact that after a while it becomes a bit repetitive, but not as much as the other two that we will talk about, I think. So, um, when it comes to songs, I would like us to play the title track, as I think, not just because I'm a major Dire Straits fan, but I really think that this is a truly standout track on this album. Uh, Beautiful performance, very smooth, very silky, um, some jazzy undertones. I love it. So let's play Private Dancer by Tina Turner.
All the men come in these places, and the men are all the same. You don't look at their faces, and you don't ask their names. You don't think of them as human. You don't think of them at all. You keep your mind on the money, keeping your eyes on the wall. I'm your private dancer, a dancer for money. Do what you want.
So that was an excerpt from the title track Private Dancer. So, Alexander, what do you think about this track?
Really like the singing in here, and also the drumming. Um, it really has that mix of, from one side, from one perspective, it is kind of slow paced and really relaxing, and then Tina just boosts the energy. So yeah, probably one of the best tracks on this album in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And if you guys enjoy this track, please check out Love Over Gold by Dire Straits, because this is straight out of that record, those sessions. So the sound is very similar, except, of course, for Tina's amazing vocals. So Mark Knopfler may not be such a great vocalist, but he has his own impressive vocal style as well, just in a different kind of way, more of a Bob Dylan sort of way, right? But music wise, it's very, very similar to the sound of that record. So you may want to check that out.
Yeah, and also if you're a David Bowie fan, please check out her cover of 1984. I think she did a brilliant job. So, Vlada, before we move on to Break Every Rule, shall we just give quickly our ratings?
Okay, so uh, it's a bit hard to choose a rating, but I would say this is a very good record, albeit with some flaws. So I will give it 7.5.
Okay, fair enough. 8 out of 10 for me. Just because of that commercial thing, but I think it's definitely an album worth listening to, especially as you said, if you're into the 80s pop, and this is really something that describes the 80s pop in one record. So yeah, let's move on to the follow-up of this record, which is called Break Every Rule, which was released in 1986. Some consider that this was a very good follow-up. So what do you, Vlada, say about that?
Look, it's definitely a pleasant album to listen to, but it lacks the personality that Private Dancer had. Private Dancer had some really outstanding tracks. You know, What's Love Got to Do with It, the title track. This one kind of is all like sort of even throughout, but there aren't any major standouts. Like the tracks are relatively pleasant. There's nothing offensive again. Um, this is the kind of album that I would love to listen to on a road trip when I'm in the car and the sun is shining outside. It's for that kind of atmosphere. It's very pleasant, very inoffensive, but that's not always a good thing. And I feel like the main thing this record has going for itself is her vocals, but everything else could have been way, way better. But then if you look at it in the context of times, this is what was asked for when it came to these major corporate albums. This is what everybody wanted to hear on the radio, for better or worse. So in that sense, it does deliver, but it's not something that I could listen to on a daily basis or put in my rotation. It's just something that is pleasant to hear maybe on the radio while you're driving. That's it.
Yeah. I might disagree a bit. I would disagree. I would agree with the part when you say that it's pretty evenly sounding, but the last two tracks absolutely blew me away. I really liked Paradise Is Here and also I'll Be Thunder. I think she did a magnificent job on wrapping up the album with those two. Obviously, this album consists of 11 songs, so saying that two songs were great and the rest were not so great certainly doesn't give you the whole impression. But these two tracks were phenomenal, and I would also like to point out the personnel here. So Steve Winwood, also Mark Knopfler, Guy Fletcher, Phil Collins. What do you think about that?
Awesome names. I mean, nothing to add there. These are all legends. But, look, all of these records are performed meticulously. There's no doubt about it. Everything, every note sung or played is excellent. But the problem is that these records, in my opinion, are just products, and they're conceived as products. And as such, they're very much of its time, which is not always a bad thing. It can get a bit nostalgic. You can enjoy that kind of sound. I, for one, enjoy hearing those 80s sounds because they take me back to my childhood in a way, I like that feel. And with an artist like Tina, who is such an amazing vocalist, you can't really go wrong if you're looking for something like that. But look, as I said previously, I wish we had included some of her older stuff that she did in the 60s and 70s with Ike. Because after listening to these records, I played one of her older records with Ike, and it was so refreshing compared to these albums. Even though you could tell that vocally when she was like in her early 20s, she still wasn't there. But the arrangements, the soul of that music, everything was much, much more refreshing, much more emotionally resonant. The instrument sounded more organic. So I think that's just me. I prefer that kind of sound, a more organic sound. And these records do not really offer that. Yeah, they do offer that only in glimpses.
But does that have something to do with your 60s bias, maybe?
Nope. This has to do with how the music is arranged, how it sounds, whether it sounds soulful or not, whether it sounds cold. You need to feel that warmth of the tone. So yeah, sure, it has all these great legends. It's musicianship on these records is definitely on a top-notch level, but there is something lacking. That being said, this is still a very enjoyable album to listen to. Don't get me wrong. It's just not necessarily my cup of tea, but I can still find joy listening to some of these tracks. For example, Afterglow, I really like that one.
Yeah, Afterglow was very good. But I would now like to pick another song. So let's play a part of Paradise is Here. Really like that track. According to Deezer, this is the most popular track, but nevertheless, I think it sounds very good and atmospheric. So let's play that one.
All right. So Paradise is Here, Tina Turner.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah, I agree. This sounds very enjoyable. There is something about those 80s sounds, and in this case, they're kind of understated. They're not so much in your face, when they get too obnoxious. But I think in the long run, if I was to listen to this kind of music for more than 3 hours in a row, I'd go insane. But right now, it does sound very pleasant, yes, and great performance. Don't get me wrong. All right, so
the ratings. Should we do the ratings?
The ratings, yes. What do you say?
I would say a 7.5. I think it's close to Private Dancer, in my opinion. Maybe slightly worse, but yeah, 7.5. I think it's a fair characteristic, so to say. What about you?
I'll be a bit stricter, so I think it's 6.5. So not a bad record, but nothing particularly outstanding about it other than her own performance, which I think is something that's just constant, that you can't expect Tina Turner to sound bad as a great performer, great vocalist. But I think that these records are a bit outdated. They're pleasant to listen to. I'm sure there's a lot of audience who would appreciate this kind of music much more than I do. So I do encourage you as listeners to take a listen and follow your own gut, so to say. But in my opinion, this is a solid effort without much substance to it.
I think this is something that the old farts would feel young when listening to.
Okay, let's not be that offensive to potentially large parts of our audience here. So
just joking. Yeah, just joking. We like this. Yeah.
Yes. If you grew up in the 80s, I think you will be able to appreciate this kind of music much more than younger folks. Even I appreciate these sounds. I was born in '84, so and yeah. It's excellent stuff.
Yeah, but I think, judging from my perspective, anyone who grew up listening to this type of music, I think they had better music to grow up to than me. So.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's my honest opinion.
True. I mean, like we have to put this in perspective. Tina was one of the biggest pop stars in the 80s, right? Nowadays, if we look at the pop stars of today, there's not many artists that come even close to this kind of level of performance, right?
I think today's pop music has very few similarities with the 80s, and that's kind of disappointing.
Now we sound like old farts, so please forgive us for that. We
Yeah.
encourage you to leave your opinion. Tell us if we're wrong about this, if we sound prejudiced. Of course, there's probably good pop music today as well, but it is our impression that there isn't anything on this level, right? And when it comes to pop music. But hopefully, in the upcoming episodes, we will be talking about some modern pop as well. All right, so the next record, we're going to the 90s now. So 1996, the record is called Wildest Dreams. So, Alexander, what do you think about this one?
I might sound a bit controversial and with an unpopular opinion, but this one sounded better than both Private Dancer and Wildest Dreams. I'm
Okay,
gonna be honest.
what do you mean? Better in terms of songs or better in terms of production?
I think better in terms of the music. I think it sits better with my taste. It's much more groovy. I think the singing is a bit more mature. I also like the album cover. You know, that's an important part of the whole experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just sits better with me, and maybe it doesn't feature some major hits like the previous two, but I think it's much more suited for my taste. And all music, again, they call it the professional rating company, whatever. 2 stars out of 5. I completely disagree with them.
No, it's I think 2 stars is too low. Maybe we'll get to ratings, right? But let's first discuss the record. Okay, this one kind of started off really good. You know, like the first song, very funky. Tina sounding very soulful in her element. So at the beginning, I really enjoyed it, but after a few tracks, it kind of petered out for me. I just couldn't stand it anymore. It all sounded too repetitive, which I think in general is the problem that plagues all of these late career Tina Turner records. That being said, I can see why you might have liked it better. It does have more of a 90s production, which I guess to some people might sound less bland and more organic. But I'm not sure this record is actually better than the previous two. In all fairness, it's definitely not better than Private Dancer, in my opinion, because Private Dancer had several major songs. It had some really good cover choices. This one, it has Golden Eye, which is a classic track from the 90s James Bond revival film Golden Eye, right? With Pierce Brosnan, his first James Bond role. So that track is very memorable and it takes me back and I enjoy hearing it again. I don't know if it's just nostalgia or if it's because of its musical merits, but it's a good track. I like the opening track as well, Do What You Do. Very funky. Love that stuff.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
There's a track featuring the late Barry White, and you know, it's a typical smooth, funky, sexy Barry White track. So that's a nice guest spot here, but it's still all kind of Tina Turner by numbers. As I said, Private Dancer is the template. As such, it's a good original record. But everything that follows, it's kind of based on Private Dancer. So it's more of the same, in my opinion.
What do you think of the fact that Bono from U2 was involved in the production? Precisely, he was involved for the Golden Eye song.
Oh, that's interesting to hear. Well, I'm not sure I trust Bono as a producer. I mean, even if you look at better U2 records, most of them were produced by Brian Eno, Flood, another great producer. So I don't know. Bono tends to be involved in everything and anything, and he's not a good example of that. You know, he's not the kind of artist that should be involved in everything, because he has certain talents that work great within the confines of his own band, but when he steps out of that, it all just seems cheesy and falls apart.
Okay. Yeah. So, would you like to pick a track? I'm assuming that you would pick GoldenEye or anything else.
Yeah, let's listen to Golden Eye, because this is the classic track from this record. One of those tracks that were big during my childhood and probably during your childhood. I mean, our listeners' childhood. Not yours, Alex, because you were born maybe like a year after this came out.
Yeah, exactly. I was born in 1997. Yeah, and before we play it, I just want to quickly touch on the 90s thing. Personally, I'm a big 90s fan. I can say that most music that I have been listening to recently is from the 90s. Not really pop music, but some very good rock tunes. And I would like to know from our listeners whether they prefer the 80s or the 90s, and what kind of transition do they see from the 80s to the 90s? Because sometimes, when I look at the late 90s and the early 2000s, I don't see much difference. I think, well, in my humble opinion, there's a bigger gap between the 80s and the 90s than, let's
Hmm.
say, the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah, in a way, especially if we talk about early 2000s, but also early 90s also have that sort of 80s sound leftovers. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think the 80s had a very distinctive sound, um, that is hard to reproduce. The 90s are already quite different, and then 2000s, it seems like all these different sounds and styles sort of blend together. So I'm not even sure there is such thing as a true 2000 sound. It's kind of difficult to define it. Unlike the 80s, where it's very clear what the 80s sounds consist of. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's give our rating for this one. I say an 8.
I say, oh, an 8, that's quite high. I say again, the previous record I gave 6.5. This one is somewhere similar. I think I'm kind of torn out between 6 and 6.5, so let's give it 6.5 as well. Again, a pleasant record to listen to, but if I hear a few songs here and there, I will be able to enjoy it. But as a whole, this is a difficult album to get through, for me at least, because it kind of peters out near the end. It's too repetitive. Again, suffering from the same problems that the 80s records suffered from. So yeah, 6.5 from me.
Okay, let's switch to GoldenEye. A bit of it.
See reflections on the water.
Mhm. All right, so we're getting close to the end of our episode. Alexander, do you have a few words for our listeners?
Yeah. So, dear listeners, thanks again for listening to our pod. We are officially on social media, so Make sure you follow us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/soundrisepod. Also on Instagram @soundrisepod. And also, if you would like to support our work and help our podcast grow, please do not hesitate to support us on Patreon. The handle is the same as for the other website, so it's patreon.com/soundrisepod. Vlada, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I also want to add that we will be having special surprises for our Patreons in the near future. We've just got this thing going, so soon enough we'll have some special treats for you. And again, I encourage you to leave your comments. Let us know what you think. Let us know if we're wrong, if we're right, if you disagree, if you agree with us. And also, we're more than eager to hear from you. Maybe suggest artists that we could cover in the future.
That's right. Thanks again. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye.